Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Bridging Unknown Paths and it's stuck behind my screen, Brighter Futures. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Alka Patel of the University of California at Irvine and a past fellow from the National Humanities Center. I want to pause just for a moment and ask Patricia Waitley if she can hear my voice. Timothy, you should be able to hear me as well. We've got some folks saying that they can't hear my voice. Please type into the chat box now if you can hear my voice. Anybody, chime in. Thanks, Timothy, appreciate it. Thanks, Jeremiah. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President for Education at the National Humanities Center. My team and I want to welcome you back tonight. We're about 2/3 of the way through this year's webinar series. And as you can imagine, in the middle of February, we've got a whole variety of things happening in context. Here in North Carolina, we're bracing for a snowstorm, which for many of you, including Mark over there in Sun Valley, probably will feel more like a rumor and gossip of snow than an actual weather event. But it's wonderful, as always, to see so many people from across the country. We've got Susan in North Carolina, who's also watching the weather anxiously with me. We've got Patricia over in Porter Ranch, which I now understand is in the valley just west of Los Angeles. Alicia up in the DC suburbs. I think one of the benefits of these kinds of sessions is bringing educators from so many different backgrounds and environments and geographies to have conversations around these compelling topics. And it's really pleasant for me to see. There's Sandra right there, who is getting, up in Wisconsin, is getting some snow. Alka, I see that you've messaged me. Please know, Alka, that you're muted until I finish my introduction, and then I'll unmute you, and you'll be able to join us. As always, I'm going to encourage you to stay in touch with Libby and Mike and myself, both through email and through Twitter. Don't hesitate at all to reach out if you have any problems or need something resolved. Don't hesitate either to let us know if you've got some ideas for upcoming sessions or things that you need that you know would be helpful for you and your teaching. National Humanities Center, hopefully that picture right there will be covered in snow tomorrow. We're located in Durham, North Carolina, and each day we get a team, a cohort of fellows from university level who come to the center and do their work as humanists. They're historians and philosophers. There are musicologists and literary scholars. There are art historians like Alka who come and do research and write and converse and generally really try to create our understanding of the world through the humanities. Our education programs then are designed to connect you, scholars, with educators and the general public to better inform the ways that we approach humanities education. If you're ever in North Carolina, please come by and visit us. You're always welcome. Or you can visit our website. Our website was carefully curated over the last 6 months to give you access to all the content of the center in searchable, indexable databases. So if you explore that, of course, in the programs, you'll be able to access all of our current education initiatives, including many that I'm about to share with you tonight. Or you can go to the search button, and if you type in a keyword, let's say art history, you might bring up a recent podcast that we directed and published featuring Morna O'Neill, also a past fellow, who was in conversation with Teresa Ascenzo, who's a art history teacher in Raleigh. And together they really talked about and thought about the practice and the process of thinking like an art historian. And this audio file, this audio content might be helpful as you begin to ask students to interact with sources and ask questions and collect evidence around some of the topics that we'll discuss tonight. Got a couple of announcements about this webinar series. As I often try to do, I'd like to remind you of both rescheduled events and open seats. Currently, we have about 18 seats left with Akram Kader and the session titled Understanding the Modern Middle East. As you know, we had to reschedule this from the fall, and once we did so, we lost the original roster. So you need to re-sign up if you did originally. There are 18 seats left when I logged in tonight. We do have 7 seats that have come open for the United States of Oil. That's our next session scheduled for February 25th. We'll be working with Tyler Priest from the University of Iowa. And we did have to reschedule Luke Bovens, plus professor of philosophy from UNC Chapel Hill. He was scheduled for March the 10th with a webinar titled Teaching Ethics with Short Stories. That night, as you may remember, we had just severe more storms here in Central Carolina, and we lost power and lost the internet, so we had to reschedule that. So there are 150 seats left because we had to essentially clear the roster, and now we're inviting you to go and sign up again through our webinar. Through our website. Finally, I do have the unfortunate news that we've had to replace Scott DeVoe. He has a session titled Jazz in American History, and it was scheduled for March the 3rd. Scott had a conflict come up that he just could not get out of, and we could not figure a way on how to bring him in from a distance. So I'm going to reschedule that likely for next year. And instead, we're going to have a pop-up session. And this pop-up session is being announced tonight for the very first time. I think it's topical and relevant. We will have registration by the end of the week, maybe by tomorrow. This webinar will be titled How Diseases Spread, Coronavirus and the History of Epidemics. We'll be working with Assistant Professor of History, Mari Wiebel from the University of Pittsburgh. Again, if you're looking for topical ways to connect kids with what's happening in our world and ways to connect them with how the humanities can help us understand that world, this to me seems like a very relevant one. And again, that's scheduled for March the 3rd, just 2 weeks from now. So we'll be sending out emails and blasts and social media, but keep your eye on our website so you can be one of the first to sign up for that session with Mary. A couple other announcements I'd like to make. Our Summer Institute is still accepting applications. We will until March the 1st, titled Contested Territory, America's Role in Southeast Asia, 1945 to 1975. We'll be using a variety of humanities disciplines to look at the complicated landscape of Southeast Asia, and then positioning the United States, particularly in its role in the American American Vietnam War. We will only be able to invite 36 educators to this 10-day institute, but you will receive a $2,100 stipend if you're selected and you come to Durham for those 2 weeks in July. So if you're interested, please do submit your application in the coming 10 days or so. Also, our online courses are currently accepting registrations. Raina and I, Raina is, I suppose, with his students right now, and we startled him with our check-in voice. But Raina has asked me a couple of times about the approval from Los Angeles Unified, and in fact, that approval has come through. These online courses are not only immersive and wonderful ways to learn in a much more in-depth way about different topics, but they are worth 35 PD hours, and that does translate into salary points. So if you are looking for one way to not only learn a lot and learn things applicable to your classroom, but also earn essentially 5 webinars, then these might be for you. If any of you are interested in taking a course, please do sign up, or if you've got a cohort or a department or a collection of folks that you work with who'd like to take a course together, please email me and we'll discuss group rates and getting courses dedicated just for you. And then finally, I'm also now accepting registration for Beyond February, Hip Hop and the African American Experience. In North Carolina, most of the state curriculum is being redesigned to make sure that we include inclusive curriculum. So this 5-day institute is a chance to not only learn about the ways that music and hip hop specifically can explore key themes and key understandings of the African American experience, but also how it can be used as a pedagogical hook. We'll be working with performance artist in residence and University of Virginia professor A.D. Carson. We do have limited space at 36. So if you're interested, please sign up, register in our website, and we would love again to welcome you to Durham in the hot months of June and July. Our Teacher Advisory Council has been a fantastic resource for us for the last 5 years. That includes Ginger Park, who's with us tonight, as she often is. It also includes Ron Wiseman up in Vermont, who should be with us tonight. The TAC is a great way for us to stay connected and to understand, I think, the needs and the gaps in the current curriculum and classroom environment. All of what we do, we attempt to address those needs and to create a community of learners and teachers around humanities education. We'll be accepting applications for next year's council in early March. They'll be due in early May, and we'll make the announcements by Memorial Day. As we begin our webinar tonight, please let me remind you that that chat box that many of you have been using to greet us and share where you're from is an important part of tonight's session. Alka and I, Professor Patel and I will be talking and discussing and moving through her slides, but it's your questions that really, I think, give these webinars the importance, the relevance that they need. So please do ask questions. Please respond to open-ended thoughts we might have. Please share links and URLs. Please suggest ways that what we share tonight might also connect with your world history classes, your AP human geography classes, your global studies classes. Let us know how this can be applicable to your curriculum and ways that we can support you in that effort. And so I'd like to introduce tonight Alka Patel. Alka, as I mentioned, was a fellow at the National Humanities Center just last year. Alka, it feels like you were just there a few days ago, but it was last spring when we pried the key out of your hand at Memorial Day. Alka's joining us from California, Southern California. Many of your audience tonight is probably just within miles from you. Alka, thanks for joining us.
I'm sorry?
I said thank you for joining us.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to do this.
I'm going to hand you the mouse in a moment, and you can begin to advance the slides and share with us your thoughts on tonight's topic. I do want to point out that you have included your email address, and I don't think that's idle planning. I think that's an invitation for all of our attendees to reach out to you, particularly those in Southern California, and to have any follow-up questions. And as I mentioned, our audience will be asking questions throughout the night. And generally, I like to start with a question just to sort of get the conversation going. So if you don't mind, I'd actually like to ask you a question for me that I think might set the tone for tonight.
Oh my goodness, Andy, always at the front of the classroom.
I'm putting you on the spot. You and I have had conversations at the center over lunch, more recently in California.
Yes.
Alka, describe for us, in your view, the difference between being an artist and being an art historian.
Well, when one is training to be an art historian, especially on the undergraduate level, so when you're at university, prior to graduate school, most art history university level curricula require some experience in actually making art. So in engaging in cultural production of the material culture variety. So I think that, the difference might seem to be something of an obvious one. Certainly artists are those who feel strongest and most expressive when they are actually producing a work that speaks for itself, while art historians such as myself are really interested in putting that work, that kind of instantaneous phenomenon, in a wider context. Of course, for contemporary work, I think the challenges are very different because there is no hindsight that we have as of yet. And then those of us who work in much older material, as I do, I guess, that has its own challenges as well, even though there is the benefit of hindsight.
That's a great answer, and I ask partly because in my own experience with younger students, and I suspect many of the teachers who are in attendance tonight might also face this, which is young kids say immediately when invited to interact with art at any level, they say, but I can't draw, or I'm not an artist, and they sort of shut down to that. Do you see that with your undergraduate students, or are they able to sort of see the distinction that you just drew?
Well, I think at least in the University of California, arena in which I've worked mostly, there is an awareness of a humanistic discipline called art history, which also can encompass the history of architecture, architectural history, which is actually what I tend to lean towards. And so there is generally an awareness between the sort of historical inquiry into an analysis of this particular type of cultural production, as opposed to actually making the cultural product. So I think there usually is an awareness, but maybe this opportunity is very important. And I mean this webinar precisely because I don't think it's too early ever to have our young people start thinking about differences and also commonalities in human expression.
Yeah.
So, whether it be the more intellectual, analytical stuff that I find myself drawn towards, or its complementary activity of actually making objects that many of us will subsequently be fascinated by. I think those are important things for the youngest of our citizens to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think you just also pulled out something that, again, if I were thinking of this as an educator of younger kids, that that you've explicitly noted that architecture, objects, material, these things are also part of the process. So maybe sometimes when kids think of art, they think of paintings and they think of museums and stuff, but you've already expanded it into domains that I think kids can really begin to understand in a much more sophisticated way. So thank you for doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just a parting, or not a parting, but another thought that you're inspiring is that it's also important to understand the kind of equal importance of all of these endeavors. When one thinks of, for instance, architecture as a profession, we have to remember that it is fundamentally a very creative enterprise. These kinds of fine distinctions that we make actually between purely humanistic or purely artistic, or for that matter, even historical as opposed to social science kinds of things, are in many ways distinctions for our own convenience.
Mhm.
They're as we know, everything exists on this planet simultaneously.
Right.
So we're just kind of slicing and dicing in order to make analysis a little easier. But that's actually why interdisciplinarity came to be such a tendency, several decades ago, in fact.
Great. Well, Alka, I've given you the mouse. You can again advance the slides using your mouse at the lower left-hand corner,
Yes.
or the buttons on your laptop. But we'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's session.
Okay, I am just a quick logistical question. I am seeing questions come up in the chat box, but I don't, am I supposed to be reading them and responding to them?
Yeah,
No, I'll get some help from you for that, right?
that's right. So as the moderator, I'm going to keep my eye on it. I'll acknowledge folks like Laura down in Miami and greet her and welcome her in. But if there are questions, I'll bring them to you. You're welcome to look at it. You're welcome to answer directly, but you also can just kind of move with your content, and I'll be here to assist you in that process.
Okay, okay, great. So first of all, I did want to point out specifically why, of course, in general, we're all fellow educators. So I would actually be very happy to communicate with anyone who would like to email. And there was another specific reason that I put this way of contacting me there, because actually, Andy, you may or may not remember during the once semester luncheons that we have with the visiting board, I believe, to the center, I asked to be placed next to the gentleman who had founded Art Store and had gone on to make the connections with JSTOR, precisely because over many, many years, actually it's more than 10 years ago, that many of my images, among which I'll be showing some to you this evening, it was over 10 years ago that they started to live on this art store platform. And at that very moment, I had started a conversation hoping that it would have been, or that it would have had a positive outcome by now. And that conversation with the art store leadership was that it's extremely important that we find ways to make these digital scholar-generated archives available across the educational continuum, not just for research and other institutions of higher learning. But in fact, it would be great if we could find a model that also permitted school districts and something that's close to my heart, other parts of the world, to have access to these extremely important teaching and learning and researching tools. So, I tried that plug again, sitting next to this person, and, tried to be polite, not to start a heated debate over lunch or anything. But that unfortunately has not yet come to pass. So I am happy to actually forward images because they're my own. I mean, I have generated these images and had them served up to the ArtStore database. So I am happy to share these images with fellow educators who would like to use them in their teaching or for any other, really intellectual or curiosity kind of purpose. So hopefully this is the start of an ongoing conversation.
Great, thank you.
Let me begin by just going over a few of the themes, I guess, that I thought would be relevant during the next hour or so as we look over the images that I'd like to focus on. First of all, and these are things, particularly the first item on the screen, I emphasize to my students, which is that there is a wonderful complementary relationship between textual sources from historical pasts and object sources from the historical past, and indeed the present. And by object, I mean in the largest sense. In fact, today you'll see that much of the focus is on architecture and landscape, and that is a big part of how we conceive of the object. So we're talking about material culture in all its forms and traces, which can be encompassed within this idea of the object. Now, both, as we know, are human generated, but forever, I think I've always been deeply cognizant of the very, very different processes that go into both producing texts vis-a-vis producing objects, and the very different cognitive processes that go into understanding them, into unpacking each of these broad categories of traces of the past. So, I mean, I think, those of us who are passionate about our areas of study, perhaps all of us say this in one way or another, but I have to say that I've always thought of the object writ large, as I just described, as really an infinite phenomenon. I don't think that there is ever kind of enough having been said about a building or an object, or in fact, a human intervened landscape. So, and as I said, I'm sure that my colleagues in history who perhaps rely primarily on textual sources may also feel the very same about their sort of archive or the things that they focus on. But I find objects to be particularly fascinating, and I'm unashamed, I guess, to say that I've always been enamored of material cultural production. So also, as I was putting together the overall images and my thoughts for this webinar, I realized that I also wanted to bring into the conversation the way that over time objects have been perceived or presented to basically either our contemporaries or to posterity. And one of the recent and most powerful tools for capturing objects has been the photograph. And, I think sometimes even almost 200 years, it's been 180 years since the first emergence of the daguerreotype. nevertheless, I wonder if our faith in this, legendary photographic ability to capture exactly what the eye sees may still not have received enough deconstruction, not to say sort of cynicism, shall we say, because I think when the technology first emerged in the mid 19th century, there was an amazement, and perhaps rightfully so, that this technology was capable of capturing something that was truly objective, that had no interference from human subjectivity. But actually, in hindsight, this is very much to be questioned. And in fact, I would add myself right into this overall series of considerations, because I have provided what is essentially a photographic archive to the platform of Artstore, which I mentioned before, and I dearly want it to be for as widespread as possible for teaching and researching purposes. But of course, arguably, it is by no means just truly objective. These images, these photographs that I have taken have been necessarily focused on the things that I have been interested in. And we'll see examples of each of these points, I guess, as time goes on. Just to finish up with the other 2 points here before we move on to the actual material, here I also wanted to highlight the all of the kind of common notions around disappearance and preservation, particularly of the built form of architecture. And the reasons thereof. I mean, some of the images that we will be looking at are definitely from parts of the world where there has been a lot of socio-political conflict and military presence and disturbances. So I think it's very easy being away from, thankfully not, in the zone of danger or the line of fire. It's perhaps very easy to kind of think that, well, so much of the historical fabric of militarily and politically unstable global region, so much of their historical fabric must have been destroyed, because after all, who has the time and the energy to take care of objects around them when they're, fighting for survival? And after all, we can't always discern where bombs and other destructive devices are falling. But in fact, there are many, many reasons that buildings in particular disappear and or take very different forms over time. And that's something that we'll also be examining. And finally, I wanted to point out the notion of a female archive, and if there is such a thing. And I definitely leave this as an open question. And I think it takes us back to kind of the overarching notion of objectivity. In my own experience in attempting, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, in attempting the documentation of buildings in different parts of the world, the plain and undeniable truth is that I am a woman. And that makes a difference in many cases as to whether I have access to a structure or not. In fact, if we think even more largely in a macro context, we know that it is harder and much more dangerous for women architectural historians like myself to travel by ourselves without, a male escort, so to speak, to certain parts of the world, not everywhere, but certainly to some places. And also in my place of origin in India itself, there definitely are some structures belonging to a variety of religious denominations that do not permit the presence of women. So if I wanted to document and thoroughly study, let's say, a certain temple or another type of structure that was under active worship, if it was within the purview of a denominational community, they would have every right to deny me access, because their belief, their worship definitely sort of supersedes, shall we say, the need for documentation and analysis. Now, I've been able to work around that sometimes. In India in particular, since I could speak to other folks there, even members of a community who would grant me access, when I explained to them that, I teach, I work in architecture, and this is absolutely for very edifying purposes, shall we say, that it would be purely educational and at most for publication if I were to do a study that I wanted to publish in a journal or in a book. So, this is something that overall kind of determines how the history of architecture in particular, and in some cases also more portable objects, if they happen to be inside some of these buildings that are not accessible to some segments of a population, the material for study is necessarily inflected basically by the types of access that are provided, certainly on this very micro level of specific buildings, etc. But if we think globally, there is also the issue of women and where women can go as opposed to and not go for the type of research they want to conduct, and that it is, by no means this kind of even playing field, shall we say. In fact, access has changed drastically, as we know, in a place like Afghanistan in the last 40 years. Prior to that, there were wonderful, intrepid women scholars and others who either by themselves or with others traveled to this land that is extremely historically and in many, many ways extremely rich. But as of the 1980s and into the present day, it is a much more difficult place to navigate, certainly across the board, but I think it makes access for women sort of a challenge unto itself. So with that, I shall get started. Now, I'm touching here on our sort of transition, shall we say, towards photography. But first, I wanted to start with these two images from the very early 19th century during the first Anglo-Afghan War, which lasted from I want to say 39 to 1842, just prior to the emergence of photographic technology. Some would argue actually in the very early 1840s was when the first stable daguerreotypes were produced. Actually, quite amazingly, very shortly thereafter, even in a place like India, where there was already a very strong European presence, particularly and eventually colonial presence. In fact, there are surviving daguerreotypes that were produced in India itself, certainly by British colonial administrators or business people, those with other interests in India, but also Indian photographers who had been part of possibly a British presence in certain specific regions of the subcontinent. So despite the emergence of the daguerreotype in particular and photographic technology generally accepted to be in France and England almost simultaneously, there was the transmission of this technology, shall we say, to other parts of the world. Now, these works that you see on the screen are actually lithographs, and one is a colored lithograph that was done by a man who was a part of the Army of the Indus, it was called, during the first Anglo-Afghan War, when the British in India were extremely concerned that Russia, the other contemporaneous empire builder who was seeing great successes throughout Central Asia, was planning on threatening their extremely profitable, extremely important colonial holdings in India. So essentially from that time forward, what came to be the nation state of Afghanistan just came to be this unfortunate buffer state, shall we say, with all kinds of conflicts and so forth fought on their land, but without their technically really having anything to do with it. They just were pulled into these much bigger conflicts, sometimes referred to as the Great Game, between the Russian and British, and to a lesser extent, other European imperialisms and colonialisms throughout Eurasia. So these lithographs I have found to be extremely fascinating, for one thing, because it indicate, or it is a very early indicator of how war, perhaps somewhat paradoxically, was also a huge documentary opportunity. So in all of the Anglo-Afghan Wars, certainly the first two, and we'll be seeing images from both, this one, the first one, and the second one, which took place only 40 years later in the late 1870s and early 1880s, it was actually the oftentimes the military engineers, the surveyors, the draftsmen who had been educated to document their surroundings with often extremely meticulous drafting abilities, which, you know, thereafter they could apply in a multitude of contexts. So not only this gentleman, who I believe is James Rattray, or another man by the name of James Atkinson, who were both members of the British military, this Army of the Indus, who went to Afghanistan to sort of stake its boundary against Russian aggression, as they would say. You know, in the meanwhile, many of these engineers, surveyors, and also doctors who were a part of the military were, in essence, capturing these scenes around them, drawing mainly, of course, during this period, and then the technology for reproduction, the favored technology was either lithograph, and there were a couple of other things that came up later in the century. But this was a way of taking one drawing and basically transferring it to a lithograph and then being able to reproduce it essentially for sale, which is what many of these soldiers and other participants in British military actions did. You'll see on the slides that essentially they are the same structures. This is an what it was left, and also even now what is left of the city of Ghazna in south, shall we say, southeastern Afghanistan, just south of Kabul. And it's one of the major kinds of way stations, shall we say, for travelers going from Kabul southward. So the Army of the Indus found itself in this vicinity due to a variety of factors and military engagements. And this particular participant in this military action took the opportunity to document these two standing minars, these towers, which perhaps you can see in the colored lithograph a little better, these towers that essentially have sort of two elements to them, both these kinds of cylindrical shafts, one being angular, almost star-shaped on plan. You can see the pointed little corners in the bottom half, while the upper part was this tapering, principally cylindrical shaft. So as of certainly the 1830s and 40s, this is what the remains of this once great imperial capital of the city of Ghazna looked like. And some of its architectural remains, including these towers or minars, still survived. And this was kind of a favorite theme, shall we say, in the artistic production of earlier 19th century Europe, which was this kind of decadence of great empires, you know, the rise and fall of great past empires. And, you know, in many ways, it was something that the British were deeply invested in, because after all, they were building an empire. And so they, collectively speaking, one could say, were very interested in how prior imperial formations had fared. And as we can see, they had not fared very well. Because once upon a time they were flourishing and had these impressive capitals that were written about by visitors from around the world, but subsequently there were just very minimal ruins that were left. Those images are actually very important to us, because by the time we reach, let's say, about a century later, so sometime between the 1840s and the 1950s, when this photograph was taken also of the site of Ghazna, we can see that in fact the top story of those two-part minars had in fact toppled down. And there is, I believe, an early, not a drawing, but in fact, of an early photograph, possibly dating to the 1870s, which shows possibly still the upper shaft of the structure of both of these, or at least one of them, of these towers intact, still in place. So from that kind of evidence, we can see that these towers, in a very short time, actually, you know, probably fell apart much more quickly than they had for the previous almost millennium, or 900 to 1,000 years. And this part of the world is seismically very active. So any, especially in a compromised structure, any kind of even minor tremor sometimes can topple these very, you know, seemingly precarious top stories of these structures. So it isn't necessarily always human intervention or a destructive, you know, urge that erases these magnificent traces of past historical empires. And I did want to emphasize that both of these photographs, speaking of a female archive, as it were actually taken by one of my personal heroes, a lady by the name of Josephine Powell, who in fact did travel in Afghanistan, apparently by herself, in the 1950s, the later 1950s and the early 1960s. It was a time, again, where it definitely was this sort of wild, untamed frontier, but thankfully there were fewer sort of explosive devices and bombs going off everywhere. And so she actually was able to undertake this incredible adventure all around Afghanistan. And in fact, for my current book project, which I was working on while I was at the center, many of her photographs, her archive, is some of the only surviving visual documentation of parts of the country of Afghanistan. And it is really to her credit and a testimony to her skill that back in the day, before digital photography, she was absolutely meticulous enough to, first of all, have the wherewithal to be able to document the thousands of photographs that she took, virtually not confusing one place with another, even though it was a matter of those physical, actual film rolls, if anybody remembers those, which had to, and I remember this in my day, which tells you a little bit about my generation and my age, maybe, which is I made the transition from analog photography to digital photography. So it was quite the ritual. I remember having to make sure that my notebook, as well as the actual film roll itself, was numbered, and sometimes each and every frame in a roll would have to be numbered and kept track of and described, so that when the images were developed later on, I would be able to identify them. And so it's incredible, I think, that Josephine Pell did all of this by herself. Very, very few of her photographs are in color, since color was less stable and just a newer technology. But for architecture, her glorious black and white photographs are more than useful. I mean, they're also extremely beautiful. And I would encourage folks to take a look at the archive that thankfully Harvard University has digitized after Ms. Pell gave all of her negatives as well as her prints to the visual resources collection there. And they have made available on the web virtually all of her photographs, though there might be a few, a very, very few, that have not been actually digitized, perhaps due to damage to the negative or something like that. By the way, am I talking over anyone? I feel like I'm going a million miles an hour here.
Well, take a moment and catch your breath, but you're not, I don't think, going over anybody. And I'll make sure that we keep us on time. But I think positioning these two images with the earlier illustrations, it seems like it's going to set you up well for the coming images. And as Jeremiah says, Jeremiah in Colorado says, this is fascinating.
Oh, good. Thank you, Mr. Snyder. I appreciate that. You know, some of us can get a little too carried away, shall we say, about buildings and photographs and so forth. So I hope that this will nevertheless kind of percolate and still be interesting as well as useful to everyone. So I did want to move forward, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
And doing a little bit of a back and forth between photographic technology and the earlier reproducible technologies of lithographs, did want to pause a moment on this, or bring into the discussion this image, which actually was also generated during, I believe it was the third and fourth decades of the 19th century, by a gentleman of the name Edward Durand. And he was something of a fascinating personality, because he was one of these sorts of lone adventurers in this part of the world. And there are actually a number of these folks who were a part of the British military and colonial establishment in South Asia, particularly in India, which in its historical iteration prior to 1947 essentially included all of what is now Pakistan, certainly the nation state of India, and spilled over also farther east, including Bangladesh and even the westernmost areas of Myanmar, what used to be known as Burma. So, in fact, the British had multiple skirmishes, honestly, ongoing simultaneously. We talked a bit about the Anglo-Afghan Wars. They also, believe it or not, at the same time, were trying to impose their will, shall we say, on other smaller principalities and potentates throughout that global region. So the so-called Anglo-Sikh Wars in the northwestern region of Punjab were almost simultaneous. In fact, the first Anglo-Afghan War, let's say, came to an end in about 1841-42, and 41 to 44 was the first Anglo-Sikh War. So they were stretched pretty thin, and it also kind of goes to show that clearly the entrenched powers in the subcontinent were not reacting well to this kind of basically, colonial sort of, not sort of, but increasingly more rigid and imposing colonial activity. So back to Mr. Durand, who was one of these adventurers who kind of either grew disillusioned with the military service or for whatever reason decided to kind of break out on his own. And here he was also traveling in the western Afghan city of Herat, which centuries before, in the 15th century, during the time when this magnificent complex would have originally been constructed, Herat was actually the capital of a vast trans-Asian empire after, in the generations following the great Timur or Tamerlane, who was himself a Central Asian emperor. And after his death, the effective capital of the empire moved to this western Afghan city of Herat, where you can imagine then, because of the great prosperity and also the kind of cultural might that this empire commanded, there were incredible, monumental, I mean, truly kind of mind-blowing monumental foundations of various uses. Certainly, there would have been congregational mosques. There would have also been complexes like this one, shown in a pretty bad condition. About 400 years later, I believe it was founded initially in the 1440s. So by the 1840s, when Mr. Durand was sort of roaming around, the structure had really undergone a lot of deterioration, in some part maybe because it was just kind of a deposit of building materials for other structures, but also because of the seismicity of the region. These buildings really had to be maintained constantly or they would very easily fall apart, being constructed basically of sometimes even sun-baked brick or maybe kiln-fired brick, but still needing sort of constant protection in order to make sure they were continued to stand. So we know that by the mid-19th century, this huge complex, which included a monumental tomb, actually it may have included more than one tomb. It had at least 6 and possibly more of these minars, these essentially freestanding cylindrical towers which, while independent construction-wise, were nevertheless associated with a neighboring building, which was also the case of the Minars we saw at Ghazna. And this huge complex would have included, let's say, a couple of pretty large royal tombs, but its overall function was to be a madrasa. Now, in contrast to the present day use of the word madrasa, historically, the original meaning of such a term was that it was, in essence, a university. It was a place of higher learning where all kinds of fields, scientific as well as theological, all kinds of fields were represented by those who were considered eminent global experts in their respective fields. And they came, and because their reputation preceded them, they would be attracting young people, students from across the world who would come and study here. So essentially, these universities provided, depending on their endowments, they would provide certainly the instruction, but possibly also accommodation and maybe even a small stipend to support the students who would come to study with these great minds in various fields. So imagine in its glory this complex essentially being that kind of an institution. Now, fast forward to 2011 when I took this photograph, and this is what is left of it. We can only see 5 of the standing minars still. One of them actually is pretty precariously tilting, which would be the 6th one, and it's not visible because it's almost sort of all the way down, and it's sort of lost in the distance of this photograph, which maybe gives you an idea of the behemoth that was this complex, made up of multiple structures, certainly, and these soaring minars, which essentially marked its sort of overall kind of footprint in the middle of this 15th century city, which really was a Eurasian, if not global capital, certainly in terms of political and military might of the later Timurids, but also because of the great intellectual motors, shall we say, that they patronized as well. So unlike the previous standing structures, which we had seen that it's unclear exactly how they lost their top stories, probably a combination of factors being seismicity, as well as maybe nearby locals mining the structures for bricks to build smaller habitations, which then would essentially compromise the building, so it's that much more prone to falling when there's a trembling or something. But the musalla, as it was historically known, was in fact destroyed. I don't know if anybody knows by whom. Is anybody familiar with this structure? It's kind of a little known fact, but I'm curious.
Let's see. It'll give you a chance to catch your breath. And I have a question for you too before we move on. But ask that question one more time. Let's see.
Does anybody have an idea of what the possible contributors to essentially the disappearance of the actual structure of this monumental foundation would be?
Any guesses? Where are our world history folks and our...
Well, yes, no takers?
It doesn't seem. So what's the answer?
Well, this is actually an important sort of, thing to consider, because in fact, it was a British approved, if not engineered, destruction. In the 1870s leading up, actually to the Second Anglo-Afghan War, the British presence in India was even more nervous than during the First Anglo-Afghan War, when the Russians had again sort of appeared to be encroaching upon this jealously guarded prize that was India, the jewel in the crown of the British presence in Asia, really. And so because there were allies and alliances and betrayals and so forth, the British, of course, were using as pawns the various contenders among the local tribal leaders, using them as pawns, essentially forwarding the interests of somebody who was more friendly towards them as opposed to somebody else. Just what I was describing before, which is this poor, place just being this kind of buffer zone where everybody played their war games and dragged them into the middle. Because one of the tribal leaders who was allied with the British was desperate to basically gain control of the city of Herat, the British military engineers, in fact, and other strategists, excuse me, advised this particular tribal leader essentially to destroy this structure, because it was ending up being the kind of hiding place of a lot of rebels and others who would then go on to create all kinds of disturbances and derail the work, and certainly, act against the interests of the British as well as their favored tribal leader.
Hey,
So,
let me ask you a quick question, particularly because you talked some earlier about access and about your role, or I should say the photographer's role. When you took this image, did you, what kinds of choices went into this image and the fact that you chose it tonight? Were there choices like direction, perspective? Are you on this hill from this distance for a particular reason, or is it kind of random? Why did you take it like this?
yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a convergence of circumstances. We were shown to the top of this particular vantage point because a very enterprising person had opened like a kebab restaurant there. And so we had gone there to have dinner, but it also provided very, very important perspectives on the present day city of Herat. And I found that that's precisely what obviously this entrepreneur was capitalizing on,
Mhm.
but also it was important for an historical overview to get a sense of the monumentality of this complex once upon a time when it was standing, and it wasn't anymore. And the choice to really talk about it at some length tonight, and excuse me, and here's the inside of one of the standing tombs. This was the lady patron, actually, the empress, the wife of the Timurid ruler, who was essentially the main patron of the entire complex. I chose this to show that, oftentimes there can be sort of a stereotypical notion that this idea of heritage preservation really was something that began with and is the most robustly championed by Europe and North America. When in fact, I mean, we have to come to grips with the reality that that is not and was not always the case. I mean, oftentimes I think of this kind of urge towards preserving buildings and so forth to be almost making up for all the stuff that was destroyed before. So that was one of the reasons why I chose this. And I did also want to emphasize that what is left of it is monumental in itself, quite grand, and there are various historical preservation interests both within Afghanistan as well as elsewhere, and they partner together to hopefully prevent further deterioration in the complex. Now, I've been told that we have, of course, a finite amount of time and still a bit of material to get through. So let me just kind of move forward. I turn now to photography and this idea of image and representation. This is a photograph that was taken by yet another military participant now in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which is datable to 1879 to 1881. And this is a fascinating album of photographs from the region of Kandahar, which is southern Afghanistan. And it is historically an extremely important area, having been the transit point for anybody traveling the overland routes across Eurasia. And the photographer was a military physician and surgeon named Dr. Benjamin Simpson. And it's actually noteworthy how many folks in this early phase of photography were, in fact, doctors. And there's a series of reasons why this is the case, partly because the very process of photography was inherently chemical in nature. So, in fact, with the professionalization of medicine, as a pursuit and a profession by this period, there were essentially legions of these doctors in various sort of colonial outposts who were very comfortable with and knowledgeable of the manipulation of chemicals, some of which, even in the photographic process, could actually be a little bit dangerous. But you also had to be ready to experiment on the fly, because depending on the climate and the humidity and various other, and even altitude of the place where you're photographing, you had to adjust the chemicals so that they would undergo a proper reaction in order to actually expose the image, as opposed to just, you know, doing like all white or all black, essentially having wasted, you know, the capturing of this image. So this photograph was taken by Dr. Simpson during about almost a year or so, or 9 months that they were posted in this region. And it shows the plains of Kandahar all around. And the plains are bounded by these wonderful promontories, which actually are filled with all kinds of historical traces as well. Now, fascinatingly, fast forward, let's say, I'd say almost exactly a century, we have this photograph from my archaeologist colleague, Warwick Ball, who was among the last generation of British Institute of Afghan Studies archaeologists who actually excavated in Kandahar. So this is the same vantage point, excuse me, the same vantage point that Dr. Simpson took and the one that Warwick took. And this juxtaposition hopefully demonstrates what the priorities were for Dr. Simpson as opposed to Warwick. Now, in the photograph, you see that there's absolutely no hint, really, of an extremely important historical ruin, which essentially the good doctor would have had probably stuck to his rear right flank, but he didn't bother to turn around to photograph it. Does anybody have a sense of what this is, this ruin? I'll show you a better photograph.
Yeah, let's take a minute and see if folks can guess what that ruin is. What do you guys think? Take a look at that, maybe expand your screen a little bit. It's like a tower, says Christopher, you're right.
Yes, so it is in fact a Buddhist stupa, most likely. Yes, an observatory. Well, you would think that's the prime position for it, given its outlook up there on the hill. But it actually was a part of about a 5th through 8th century Buddhist monastic establishment. Buddhism was extremely strong in historical Afghanistan, virtually from the very earliest centuries of the Common Era onward. And this Buddhist monastery, which would have included the stupa, which would have been this rounded mound of earth that would have been sort of the central ritual focal point, and most likely the monastic kind of residential areas quite possibly would have been underneath it. The fascinating thing about Afghan Buddhism, or Bactrian Buddhism, as it's called historically, is that rather than always having independent monastic structures, they actually would carve out caves for the actual residential parts of the monastic complex. Down here below, wonderful vantage point from this Buddha stupa, we can see the plains of old Kandahar, which was actually a settlement from prehistoric times onward, and into the 18th century. Into the 18th century, we had a satellite, shall we say, establishment of another walled settlement a few kilometers to the east of the prehistoric settlement. So somebody wrote about Alexander the Great's towers in Ghazna, Mr. Sarsena, but I don't know of any of Alexander the Great's towers in Ghazna. What are those?
Alexander the Great's towers.
I mean, it might be that the Minars that we just talked about, which were in Ghazni or Ghazna, are sometimes misinterpreted to have been, or thought to be, of the period of Alexander, but actually they're documentable as 11th and 12th century structures. So anyway, so this juxtaposition, or this kind of examination of the photographs, was meant to show the real subjectivity that creeps into even photographic documentation, that it actually is not this totally objective thing that captures absolutely everything that is in the landscape. In fact, all points of view are curated, including mine. So not to just kind of cast stones at others. Now, I wanted to turn to the way that buildings are actually, in many instances, repurposed. And that is one way that some might say, looking at it glass half full wise, some might say that they actually are preserved in some shape or form into subsequent centuries, while others would say, but they are irretrievably altered. So interestingly, the Great Mosque, the Congregational Mosque in Herat, was actually a very important structure, probably from the 10th century onward. But in the 12th century, in about the 1190s through 1200, there was a very important renovation project, because apparently the structure had not only undergone some partial destruction because of a fire, but then there had also been an earthquake. So in the 12th century, the local rulers thought it important enough, because the city of Herat was extremely significant on trade routes and so forth, to make sure that this building was in good shape. So they actually reconstructed the southern part of this, again, very large complex, and added this monumental portal, which historically would have provided access into the actual structure. But in the 15th century, some changes were made to it, and I will come back to that. Now, you've all noticed the actual form of this arch, the fact that it is part of a larger wall made up of other smaller arches. And this, as a very recognizable architectural form, was actually transmitted to India. When these rulers called the Ghurids actually expanded their empire into northern India, this was the kind of favorite monumental architectural form that they took with them. And what you see in the top of the screen is the very first really large size or monumental scale mosque complex that was built in northern India, in fact, anywhere in the subcontinent. And it was the largest of its time, certainly within South Asia during the 12th century. And it has a lot of very noteworthy characteristics, one of which is actually, again, these smaller arches that are centered by a large monumental arch in the middle. And again, the same would have continued on this side. So just to show that this was in fact a favored architectural form, we can see that another example, in fact, from slightly earlier in the mid 12th century from Eastern Iran. I'm teaching. Go tell Papa. So let's see. Excuse me.
We've all been there.
I'm busy right now. Tell Papa. Go. Sorry about that.
It's no problem at all. Every single person in this room has been through this in one form or another.
Even though I made it very clear that I was busy at this moment. Anyhow, so when we take a closer look at the way that the architectural forms and the decorative program was actually manifested in northern India, we can see the resonances with the Congregational Mosque of Herat, where there had been a very visible, very beautiful epigraphic program, hard a little bit to read because of the style of the script, which is Kufic. And here, nevertheless, in its Indian version, there is also a heavy presence of Arabic calligraphy. These are Quranic verses, while in the Herat example, actually, these were the titles of the sovereign who built or rebuilt and renovated this part of the mosque. But the thing to notice is that even in this very first monumental construction of a mosque in northern India, we can see that there is a local interpretation, in essence, of the architectural norms for monumental building from the Iranian world. So let's see, but at the same time, that very same facade had its equal share of extremely luscious and really pleasing to the eye floral motifs, which were just as abundant, really, and in fact alternated, as you can see in this detail, alternated with the calligraphic bands. So I always emphasize to my students that there actually was a combination of age-old Indian decorative programs, as we see on Buddhist stupas here, for example, all the way from the 5th century, and on other ritual objects. This also happens to be a Buddhist ritual object from even earlier. So these kinds of very rich floral decorations were really an integral part of this monumental mosque complex, which was really the very first to be constructed on this scale in northern India. So some of you, especially those who have visited this part of the world, already know of the towering Kutub Minar, which actually we saw possibly a slight shadow of in the previous slide, it in fact, just like those towering minars that we had seen before, was associated with this mosque, though it was structurally independent of it, but it definitely sort of acted as a pair. So as you can see here, the Minar has been dated to approximately 1199, probably having taken several years to actually construct. And indeed, it was only constructed up to the first story by its original patron, and all of these subsequent stories were added over the next 2 centuries. So it definitely was designed as, again, another transplantation of those that architectural vocabulary from greater Iran, in essence. We had seen the minars at Ghazna, or Ghazni, as it's called sometimes, that had lost by the 1950s their top stories, their cylindrical stories. But one can definitely trace something of a bigger evolution. In northeastern Iran, for instance, in the very early 12th century is when this particular minar is dated. And as you can see, it is also structurally independent, but associated with its nearby mosque, which then was maybe translated or made more complex a little eastward in Afghanistan with these pointed, the kind of stellate plan of the bottom story of this tower, and ultimately translated once again into, whoops, this kind of a tower in northern India. So the whole point here is that there is this great dialogue between these kinds of architectural cultures, shall we say, these ways of building, so that the expansion of this Afghan empire into northern India actually brought all kinds of new architectural forms and really created a whole surge of innovation in the local architectural culture of northern India. Another part of this complex that is extremely fascinating is actually the reuse or repurposing of lots and lots of structural materials. And this is actually very much a part of the present day public and political dialogue in India, where there is growing anti-Islamic sentiment with politicians, in essence, citing examples such as this to say that these Muslim barbarians came and destroyed so many of Indian temples, and then made their own constructions and mosques out of them. So evidently, when we analyze these structures, we can see that there is a lot of reusing of materials, but the interpretation of this act really has to be opened up to a variety of interpretations, not least because when we go back to what the same rulers had done in Herat at the Congregational Mosque, we can see that this too, over the centuries, had actually come to be repurposed so that this added sort of spandrel inside of this overall arch was in fact a 15th century addition after yet another fire and destructive earthquakes. So, I mean, this is a tough place to be, where this whole structure, certainly the monumental portal, was in essence kind of maintained by a 15th century power, but nevertheless kind of refashioned. And this, I was allowed to climb up in the back of this structure to see what the inside of the original 12th century arch was, which nevertheless was actually hidden, if you think about it, or at least sort of camouflage, not just left alone by this later 15th century intervention. So all of this is to say that in the present day, interpretations of how structures are reused are something that need to be opened up, and that a monolithic interpretation is not all that is possible. Now, let's see. I am having tears on my end, but I think I can power through this.
Yeah, we have just about 5 more minutes,
Okay.
and we'll wrap up your final sections here.
Yes. So this is a little closer to home and nearer to our time as I headline for this series of images. This was during some field work that I recently did in Cuba. And those of you who are actually in Southern California may find this somewhat familiar. I know many of you have assigned mission projects to some of your students, and courtyards such as these may be quite reminiscent of many of the surviving California missions. And in fact, I kind of brought this in for that very reason, because there are some things, details to unpack behind this type of architecture, which all of us live with really in close quarters. Now, on the inside of this, which was kind of a gubernatorial palace, it was a the kind of ruler place, the place of residence. Here we can see these very intricately carved wooden ceilings, which actually were to be found not just in these residential structures, but also inside very innocuous looking Baroque churches. This is an 18th, actually 17th and 18th century example coming from the northern part of Cuba. And inside here also, we can see that these really, really beautiful ceilings have been used. And I bring these up because one of my projects, maybe in retirement, so to speak, will be the tracing of Islamicate art forms from Spain and Western Europe, where Islamicate culture had a very long presence, to the New World. And while the actual laborers who were imported, in essence, into the New World to construct many of these buildings, because remember, in a place like Cuba, and I'm not talking about the Aztecs and the Mayas in the mainland of the Southern Americas, but in a place like Cuba and also in California, we had a very ephemeral indigenous cultures, nothing that had monumental architecture as a part of it. So just as the so-called reconquest or the reconquista was happening in Spain and the Catholic kings were coming in, we find them, in fact, encouraging many of the artisans who had been a part of Islamicate culture actually travel to the New World, essentially to help construct it. So as I said, while I was able to do most of my field work in Cuba, across the islands and so forth, I eventually will get around to maybe writing a book that would include perhaps some of the California missions as well. So I guess the takeaway from all of this is a building never should be judged by its outside. There's always more to see and learn. And my own personal mantra is objects are infinite. Thank you very much.
Well, Alka, thank you so much. You shared so many things with us, and of course, I'll remind our whole audience that I've recorded tonight's session, and they'll be able to go back and linger with many of your thoughts and compare it to the slides that you've made when we're completed. I do have one question for you before we wrap up tonight.
Yes.
Tell me how drone photography is changing the kind of work that you do and the kind of sites and spaces that you've been exploring.
Andy, you've been talking to people, students in my class,
I
because
have
last
not.
is precisely what one of my students said to me.
Yeah.
And now we know, though, that we're all kind of confronting, issues of privacy and so on and so forth. So actually, I think once those kinds of finer points are sorted out, I think that there would be incredible potential in drone photography.
Are
The
you
thing is
are you
that,
are you aware of any cultural or um, geographic issues with drone technology? I mean,
well, I
it's more
think
than
in a
just
place
flying a
like,
machine over space, right? Like how do people receive that?
yeah, well, I think in a place like Afghanistan, which is going through a tumultuous and very precarious period, I really don't think that drone photography would be the way to go at this point, even though sometimes, the remote unmanned craft are some of the only ways to get to parts of the country. Nevertheless, I mean, I think we can all imagine why, given the militarily and politically very sensitive situation, that it would be difficult in a place like Afghanistan.
Yeah, of
But
course.
in other parts of the world, I mean, I would love to see, for instance, on from a mapping perspective, let's say aerial photography of even the island of Cuba. I mean, just
Right,
to take the most recent example, to kind of map where these structures were actually located, you
right.
know?
It really does
I mean,
seem like it seems like it would be a game changer for the work that you do, the professional approach that you take,
mhm.
to have access to that sort of footage.
Yes. Oh, yes. And satellite imagery and other aerial photography. Somebody in the chat, I forget who, mentioned aerial photography ever since World War One, the pigeon cameras. Yes. Ms. Antoline. In fact, that data is incredibly important. And now with satellite imagery, there's even more that can be done even if physical access to a region is not always available. There's a lot of now analysis of satellite images from parts of Afghanistan, for instance, for historical purposes.
Well, again, thank you for guiding us through the presentation, sharing with us the wealth of your own personal photographs, but also contextualizing them in a way that can help inform a lot of what these folks will be teaching. Alka, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. Bye, everyone. Hope to hear from you guys on email or something.
And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. It looks like I'm going to go through a couple of last slides. Thank you for joining us tonight. Again, you will have a recording of tonight's session. You'll also have access to these PowerPoints. Please do follow the National Humanities Center on social media. Take a look at our website to be able to sign up for any of the institutes or the courses I've mentioned. Follow our social media to see upcoming announcements, including registration for the new pop-up webinar scheduled for March 3rd on the history of epidemics in helping to understand the coronavirus. And I hope to see many of you at our next session scheduled for February 25th. We'll be working with Tyler Priest with a session called The United States of Oil. In just a moment, I'm going to launch the post-webinar survey. Once you've completed it, you'll be able to download your certificate of attendance. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day at school tomorrow. We'll see you again at the next Humanities in Class webinar. Good night.